The night the drums stopped, even the stars seemed to hold their breath. The air above Kaylee's village was thick with dust and judgment, carrying the faint scent of burning corn and fear. In the middle of the square stood Lember, her wrists bound, her back straight though her strength had long faded. The ropes bit into her skin, but it wasn't the pain that hurt her most. It was the eyes of the people she had known her whole life, watching in silence as if her suffering were part of some cruel ceremony they could not escape. When the chief raised his hand, the crowd fell still. Chief Kambali liked silence. It made his voice sound heavier, more sacred, as if his words were law written in the wind. He stood high above them all, robes swaying, face carved with arrogance. "This woman," he declared, pointing at Lember, "has betrayed the trust of this village. She stole food meant for our warriors. A thief, a traitor, a danger among us." A murmur rippled through the crowd, weak, uncertain, afraid. People nodded, not because they believed him, but because fear is easier than courage. Lember's lips trembled, but when she spoke, her voice was calm, even gentle. "I didn't steal anything," she said. "I took what was left. For the children in the mud house. They have no father. They have no bread. If feeding the hungry is a crime, then let all of you condemn me." Her words floated above the square like a flock of frightened birds. Some women lowered their heads in shame. Others pressed their hands to their hearts as though her pain had struck something sacred within them. The chief's face tightened, his authority cracking under her honesty. At the edge of the crowd, beneath the wide shadow of a baobab tree, the hunter Armadi watched. His eyes were sharp, trained to spot truth the way others saw tracks in dust. He knew she was innocent. Everyone did. But in Kali's village, knowing and speaking were two very different things. Armadi's chest felt heavy, like a bow drawn too long. He saw the same fear in the villagers that he'd seen in cornered animals, paralyzed, waiting for mercy that would never come. He wanted to step forward, to say something, anything. But his mother's voice echoed in his mind. Haste is the sister of mistake. Justice, when it comes at the right time, becomes a blessing. So he stayed still, his anger folded tight inside him like a secret arrow waiting to fly. Then old Zuber, the village elder, stepped forward, leaning on his staff. "Chief Kambali," he said weakly, "let me speak." But Kambali sneered, his pride louder than respect. "Old man, hold your tongue. You can barely see, you can't hear, and you certainly can't think. Sit down before you shame yourself." The insult struck the crowd harder than any blow. In their hearts, they all knew. Respect for the elders was sacred. To mock Zuber was to spit on their ancestors. Murmurs spread like sparks. Kambali raised his hand again, shouting, trying to smother the fire he'd just lit. "Enough!" he roared. But fear and doubt had already taken root. Lember closed her eyes. The heat burned her skin, and the taste of dust filled her mouth. She remembered the faces of the hungry children she'd helped, and felt no regret. What crushed her wasn't the ropes or the shame. It was the lie. Injustice dressed as truth is the cruelest poison. Armadi's fingers curled around his bow. He wanted to scream, to shatter the silence that had become their prison. But he waited, watching, memorizing, every cruel glance, every cowardly nod, every tear that streaked Lember's face. The chief ordered her ropes replaced to teach her humility. The guards obeyed. Lember bit her lip until blood touched her chin, but she didn't make a sound. An old woman whispered to her neighbor, "Justice that humiliates is vanity dressed as law." Those words rippled through the air, and suddenly, people began to see. The illusion of Kambali's power flickered. As the sun sank behind the trees, painting the huts in shades of fire and ash, Armadi's heart pounded harder. He couldn't sit idle any longer. But to act too soon would be suicide. Injustice, he thought, was a weed. You had to pull it by the roots, or it would grow back stronger. He met Lember's gaze across the square. She wasn't asking for pity, just for someone to see the truth. When the crowd dispersed, whispers lingered like ghosts in the air. Fear still ruled, but now it shared its throne with doubt. Lember remained tied, her body trembling, her dignity still unbroken. Armadi walked home beneath a darkening sky, each step heavier than the last. He didn't light a fire. He didn't eat. He simply sat by the door of his hut, listening to the crickets sing and his own thoughts rumble like distant thunder. He knew this story wasn't finished. Night came slowly, wrapping the village in gray silence. The fires burned low. Only the stars watched. Armadi sat with his bow across his knees, staring toward the square where Lember still stood tied to the post. Every time he blinked, he saw her face. Tired, bruised, yet brave. Inside him, something began to move, like a river breaking free from stone. He remembered the vow he'd made years ago. never to take sides, never to fight another man's power. His father had died in a feud between chiefs, burned by politics he never believed in. Since then, Armadi had hunted alone, spoken little, kept to the edges of life. But tonight his silence felt wrong. It wasn't the calm of peace. It was the silence before a storm. He looked up at the stars scattered across the sky like seeds and whispered, "Show me the way." The wind rose gently, rustling the baobab leaves. To him it sounded like an answer. The just do not hide. Down in the square the guards grew lazy, tossing stones and laughing, unaware that the air itself had changed. The village slept uneasily. Somewhere, old Maya prayed softly, her voice trembling. "Lord of the winds, protect those who have courage." She felt something stirring in her chest, as if the spirits of the ancestors were waking from their long sleep. Dogs barked at shadows. Women crossed themselves. Men pretended to rest while keeping one eye open. Something unseen was moving, shifting the ground beneath them. Inside his hut, Armadi ran his thumb along the blade of his machete. The steel was cool against his skin. It was the same tool he'd used to free animals caught in traps, and tonight he knew. There were cages not made of iron that hurt far worse. He took a slow breath and felt his mother's words rise once more. Good and evil walk the same road, but good must not fall behind. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from fate. And somewhere in the distance, the drums that had fallen silent seemed to echo again, faint and far away, as if calling the hunter toward his choice. It was as if time itself was pushing him. He closed his eyes and listened to his heart. Each beat was an answer out in the distance. The sound of ancient drums seemed to echo in the air, though no one played them. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was the ville's memory reminding them that justice still existed. Amardi remained in silence, and in that silence a decision was being shaped. He never planned to be a hero. He just wanted to sleep in peace, and he knew that only the just sleep in peace. Later, when the embers had faded and the village was deep in darkness, Amd rose once more. He walked to the edge of the forest, looked up at the full moon and whispered, "God, if my silence pleases you, protect me. But if it is your will that I speak, give me courage." No answer came, only the distant song of an owl. But in that moment he felt it. The silence was no longer doubt. It was a calling. And so the hunter who had always lived in silence understood that there are days when silence is not a virtue. It is cowardice. And there are moments when the voice of a just man must echo, even if it costs him his life. Am's heart had finally chosen a side, and fate, which until then had waited in the shadows, began to draw near. The moon rose high, clear as an ivory blade, spilling its light over the thatched rooftops. The village courtyard was almost empty. Only 2 guards remained on watch, their bodies tired, their eyes lost in the fire that was already dying out. The silence of the night was broken only by the song of crickets and the distant sound of the river flowing as if unaware of the pain of men. Amadi moved through the forest with firm, light steps, like someone who knows every root and every shadow, but his heart beat like a war drum. He carried a machete and the fear hidden deep in his chest. Every crack in the brush made him hold his breath. It wasn't death he feared. It was misting his courage. Sometimes acting too soon is a loss. Sometimes waiting is a betrayal of the heart. And that night Armad felt that waiting no longer fit inside his soul. Lem's plea whispered that morning echoed like a vow. "Please help me escape." It was a simple phrase, but it carried the weight of all the injustices a man can witness and still remain silent. He approached the courtyard, staying in the shadow of the great Ba. From there he saw Lumber tied up, her wrists swollen, her head hanging. The guards whispered to each other, sharing a jug of drink. One of them, the younger, struggled to stay awake. The other, older, stared into the fire with the look of someone who no longer believed in anything. Armed waited. Time dragged on, and the moon, patient, bore witness to it all. When the young guard closed his eyes for a moment, the hunter moved. He stepped on the ground as if stepping on the soul of the wind. Without sound, without haste, the machete gleamed for a second, then disappeared again into the darkness. He knelt before her. Lumber opened her eyes slowly, unsure if she was dreaming or if God had granted her a miracle. His lips moved and she heard the whisper. "If God gave me 2 hands, it was too free not to bind." The phrase crossed the air like an ancient prayer, and for a moment even the crickets went silent. Amadi cut the ropes carefully, making sure the sound of the blade was lost in the wind. The cords gave way, and red marks stood out against Lember's dark skin. She groaned, holding back tears, and brought her hands to her face. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He simply helped her to her feet. When Heffenly spoke, it was soft, like someone speaking to his own conscience. "Because some crimes are only committed by silence. Lumber staggered. Her legs wouldn't obey, and her body trembled. Armed held her by the shoulders steady. Scanning the older guard shifted in his sleep, and Armed froze. The man simply turned to the other side and went back to snoring. Fate that night seemed to be on their side. Lember looked up at Thesky and murmured, "My God, if it is your will, hide us in your shadow." Her faith was like a small candle, but bright enough to light the path ahead. They passed through the wooden gate, and a strong gust of wind blew out the fire. It was as if nature itself wanted to protect the fugitives. On the other side, the forest awaited dense, dark, alive. Amarty guided Lumber through the trees, led by the instinct of a hunter. Every sound was a warning, every leaf a secret. Lumber stumbled, but he didn't stop. "Hold on," he said. "Freedom is heavy at first." She only nodded, gripping his shoulder with the strength she had left behind them. The village slept, but the wind carried the promise that when the sun rose, Lumber's absence would be discovered, and what would follow had no turn. Amarty knew that, and still he didn't look back. His face was calm, like a man who had already accepted the price of doing what's right. They reached a clearing where the moon filtered its light through the branches. Lember fell to her knees, exhausted. Armed knelt beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said, "Rest a little. We still have a long way to go." She looked at him, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "You're going to die because of me." Amarty took a deep breath, looked out toward the horizon, and replied, "I'd rather die doing what's right than live on my knees before what's wrong." The wind blew once more, carrying away the last embers of the village. At the top of the mountain, a night bee bird let out a sharp cry as if announcing change, and there, in the shadow and in courage, two destinies became entwined. The decision of a simple man would become in time the living. The forest swallowed them like a secret. The damp ground covered in dry leaves creaked beneath AMD's feet, but he knew every sound, every breath of the woods. He carried Lemur on his shoulders, for she no longer had the strength to walk. Her body trembled, and the face, once steady, now flickered between pain and relief. "Hold on," the hunter whispered, and the sound of his voice was gentler than the wind. The smell of wet earth mixed with the blood running from her wrists. The moon peeking through the treetops seemed to follow them, a silent witness. Behind them, the first drum sounded, a distant sound, but unmistakable. The warriors were awake. Amarty stopped for a moment, listened, and knew they had little time. Each drum beat was a warning, an echo of Kaylee's power spreading through the night. Lumber opened her eyes, startled. "They're coming after us." Armad didn't answer. He adjusted her weight on his shoulders and kept moving. He didn't run. He advanced like someone who trusts in his own silence. Hurry reveals fear, and he couldn't allow fear to guide his steps. The forest was ancient. The twisted trees seemed to speak to each other, whispering stories of past hunts and escapes. At every bend, the drums sounded closer. Amarty knew they had to cross the river before dawn. Only then would their tracks be lost. The path there was harsh, full of thorns and steep slopes. But courage is like fire. It grows when the wind tries to put it out. Lumber tried to speak, but her voice broke. "Why are you risking your life for me? You owe me nothing." Armades stopped and looked at her. The moonlight traced on his face an expression of both resolve and compassion. "No one owes justice anything. Justice is everyone's duty." Then he continued walking. Lemur's breath mingled with the rustling leaves, and his heart beat with the strength of someone carrying not just a body, but a destiny. Dot. Suddenly, a crack. A branch breaking to the left. AMD leaned limber against a tree trunk and signaled for silence. The forest rustling stopped. Two warriors passed just a few meters away, their torches lit, searching for tracks. The smell of smoke reached them. Lumber closed her eyes and held her breath, afraid even that would betray them. Armed remained still, gripping his machete. Time seemed to stop. One of the warriors raised his torch and looked in their direction. The fire lit Leby's face for a second, and Armad's heart pounded harder. But the warrior turned away, muttering something, and kept walking. When their footsteps faded, AMD exhaled slowly. "Let's go," he whispered. Lumber tried to stand, but her legs gave out. He lifted her again, and they continued down the winding trail to the river. The path was steep, and the rocks slipped underfoot. With every step, the drums faded, but the exhaustion grew harsher. Lumber whimpered softly, and Amarty, though exhausted, kept pace. Sweat ran down his forehead, mixing with dust and dried blood on his hands. They reached the riverbank just as dawn began to break. The sky was still deep blue, and the first birds began to sing. The river ran wide, reflecting the moon like a blade of liquid silver. Lem looked at the water and wept. "I can't cross." Ahmed looked to the other side, where the forest rose into mountains. "Then I'll carry you." He lifted her onto his shoulders again, stepped into the river, and felt the cold current rise against his legs. The water climbed to his waist, then to his chest. His body was heavy, his muscles burned, but he pressed on Dot in the middle of the crossing. Lemur cried silently, not from fear, but from gratitude. "You should have let them kill me," she said. Amarty, his voice steady despite the strain, replied, "Who lets an innocent die is already dead inside." When they reached the far shore, they collapsed on the wet earth. The sun had begun to rise, painting the horizon in gold. The drum far behind had fallen silent. Lumber turned her face to the sky and murmured, "If I live to tell this, no one will believe me." Amarty looked at her, chest still heaving. And replied, "They don't have to believe. It's enough that the truth stays alive." They stayed there for a moment, breathing in the new air, caught between fear and hope. The day was being born, and with it, the price of the choice they had made. The forest was now behind them, the river between them and the past. Ahead lay only the unknown. But for those who carried the weight of injustice, any path was better than silence. And so between exhaustion and courage, Amarty and Lem pressed on, two fugitives guided by something Kaylee's power could never silence, the certainty that freedom is just another. The sun was already rising behind the mountains when the roar of the drums spread across the village. It was the sound of Kaylee's fury, the betrayed chief. His voice echoed across the courtyard, thick and heavy with rage. "Bring them back dead if you must." The warriors, armed with spears and bows, lined up before him. The tracking dogs howled restlessly, picking up the scent of the escape. The people watched from a distance, torn between fear and shame. No one dared say that the woman the chief called a criminal might be the most innocent among them. Kaylee climbed the council stone where he usually spoke during ceremonies. His expression was that of a man afraid of losing his throne. A hunter dared to challenge the power of this village. He shouted, "And now everyone will see what happens to those who rise against the chief." Some warriors hesitated, remembering the hunts they had shared with Amarty, Theman who had never left a wounded companion behind. But fear was a hot iron that branded their souls, and they lowered their heads. The drums began again, calling the hunt dot. Meanwhile, Amarty and Lem were already climbing the slope that led into the thick forest. The ground was slippery, and with each step her legs faltered. He held her firmly, helping her climb, though his own muscles still burned from the river crossing. Behind them, the sound of thee-dogs began to echo. The hunter looked back and saw birds lifting off in circles. "They're coming," he said, his voice steady. Lembers swallowed her tears and picked up the pace. Fear pushed her forward, but it was hope that kept her on her feet. The crunch of broken leaves, the echo of distant voices, the sharp whistle of spears through the air. Everything felt closer. Sweat ran down Ahmed's face mixed with dust and dried blood. They paused for a moment in the shadow of a rocky outcrop. He studied the terrain through the valley, faster but more exposed. He murmured, "The slope will take twice as long, but they might lose our trail." Lumber breathed heavily. "Do what your heart tells you," she replied. The hunter looked at her, and in that moment saw in her eyes something that humbled him. Courage. Not the courage of a warrior with a weapon, but the quiet courage of someone who carries pain and keeps going anyway. "I'd rather die doing what's right than live on my knees before what's wrong," he said, and the words hung in the air like a vow. Lee nodded, saying nothing. They chose the slope. The rocks cut into their bare feet, and their hands clung to exposed roots. The sun was already burning strong, and the weight of exhaustion pressed down. Behind them, the sound of the dogs grew louder. A long howl sliced through the air, and Amarty knew they were close. He picked up the pace, pushing Lemur forward. "A little more," he said. "The mountains just ahead." Fate seemed to be toying with them. A branch snapped and the echo gave away their direction. 3 warriors emerged from between the trees, shouting, "Ah, turned! Machete in hand!" The metal flashed in the sunlight for a moment. The first warrior charged with a spear, but Amarty dodged and struck the shaft. The dry crack of wood echoed through the forest. The man fell, and the other 2 stepped back. "Go back and tell the chief that evil does not defeat those who walk with truth," Amarty shouted, his chest heaving. The warriors hesitated. One of them, young and his face marked with doubt, lowered his weapon. "Amarty," he said, "I don't want to fight you." But the older one pushed him and fired an arrow. The hunter ducked, pulling Lember down. The arrow whistled past and struck a tree trunk. The younger warrior shoved his companion and shouted, "Enough!" There was a brief scuffle between them, and Amarty used the moment to retreat. He knew time was still his greatest enemy. They climbed higher, and the air grew colder. The village was now a distant dot, lost on the horizon. The sound of drums had vanished. Lemus stumbled and fell to her knees, exhausted. Amarty helped her up and looked at the sky. "We're close," he said. "Just beyond this hill, there's an old hunter's hut. We can rest there, Lumber looked at him, eyes full of tears. "And if they find us," took a deep breath, gazing down at the valley below. "Then we'll fight with what we have, because some battles, even when lost, save the soul." And so, side by side, they climbed the last stretch, guided by something greater than fear. Behind them, the sun was slowly setting, painting the escape path red. The day was ending, but the hunt was not, and as night fell once more over the land, Amadi knew he wasn't just running for the first time. He was following his own truth. The mountain wind blew cold, carrying the scent of wild flowers mixed with the ashes of old campfires. Amadi and Lumber reached the mountaintop as the sun disappeared behind the hills. Their bodies trembled from exhaustion, and every step felt heavy, as if the ground itself tried to pull them back. Lumber could barely keep her eyes open. Her knees gave out, and her face covered in dust and sweat no longer hid the fatigue. Amadi held her tightly, guiding her to a clearing where an old hunter's hut stood, nearly swallowed by time and overgrown brush. The hut was simple, made of darkened logs, with a thatched roof crumbling and walls marked by years of rain. Amadi pushed the door open with his shoulder and was met by the scent of damp wood and dry leaves. There was a broken bench, a torn mat, and a single clay pot still intact. He took a deep breath, looked around and murmured, "The wind doesn't reach so strong in here." Lumber slowly sat down on the floor, cradling her wounded wrists. The blood had dried, but the marks from the ropes were still deep, reminders of the humiliation she'd endured. Armed lit a small fire with dry branches. The flames wavered, then steadied, casting a warm glow over their tired faces. The crackling wood brought a moment of comfort. Lumber watched his hands, steady and careful as he tended the fire. There was something calm about Amadi, a strength that didn't come from the blade, but from the heart. "You could have escaped alone," she said quietly. "I would have been forgotten." He looked at her, the fire reflecting in his eyes. "It wasn't you who asked me to run. It was justice that asked to be set free." Silence filled the space. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the wood. Inside, the fire made the shadows dance across the walls. Lumber rested her head against the log wall and closed her eyes. Amadi tore a strip from his own shirt, moistened it with water from the pot, and began cleaning her wounds. She winced with pain but didn't complain. When he finished, he wrapped her wrists with improvised bandages and said, "It'll heal, but some pains aren't meant to disappear. They're meant to remind you of who you are." Lumber opened her eyes and looked at him. There was more than gratitude in her gaze. There was a kind of ancient trust, as if their fates had been joined long before that night. "Do you believe God still watches over us?" she asked almost in a whisper. Amadi smiled without showing his teeth. "God never looks away." "Lumber, it's we who turn our eyes when we stop doing what's right." She said nothing, staring into the fire. The weariness weighed down on her, and her breathing grew slow. Amadi noticed and unfolded the blanket he had found in the corner of the hut. He covered her carefully, making sure the cold wouldn't reach her. Lumber mumbled something half dream, half prayer. "If I die, tell the people I only wanted the children to eat." The hunter clenched his fist and replied firmly, "You'll live to say that with your own voice." Outside, the drums could no longer be heard. The village was far behind, and the world for Amament seemed suspended between fear and hope. Armed sat at the door of the hut, his machete beside him, and watched the horizon. The sky was clear, and the stars, so close, seemed to be listening to his thoughts. He thought of his father, his mother, and the elder Zuber, of the lessons life teaches without words. Who protects the innocent protects their own soul. The old man used to say the fire was dying down and the cold returned. Amadi remained awake, alert to every sound. The forest has many eyes, and that night he couldn't afford rest. From time to time, he glanced at Leah, who slept peacefully for the first time since being tied in the village square. There was something sacred in that moment, not the holiness of temples, but the sanctity of what is just, of what remains pure amid pain. When dawn came, the hunter closed his eyes for a brief moment. The wind brought the scent of mountain flowers, and he knew that at least for that night, they were safe. The flames slowly faded, and the silence of the mountain filled the shelter. Lima slept deeply, and Amadi, standing guard, protected not only her life, but the hope of an entire people, who even unknowingly had begun to awaken. Dawn arrived gently covering the mountains with a light mist. The sun still slept behind the peaks when Amadi stepped out of the hut. The air was cold and pure, and the birdsong sounded like an ancient prayer. He looked out over the valley and saw the village in the distance, small, nearly swallowed by the horizon. Down there, destiny moved without hurry, preparing the next wound or the next healing. AMD knew the escape wasn't the end. It was only the pause before the reckoning. Lemur woke slowly, her body feeling a little lighter. Her wrists still ached, but the pain now was a sign of life. She looked around, confused for a moment, until her eyes found Amadi's. He stood steady, staring at the horizon. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. Without turning, she gave a faint, weary smile. For the first time in many days, the hunter nodded, though his gaze remained distant. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that matures the soul. Suddenly, the sound of brittle footsteps broke the morning's peace. Amadi turned quickly, machete in hand. Between the trees, a figure approached with difficulty. It was an old man, white heda and in a torn tunic. Elder Zub. He limped, leaning on his staff and breathed with effort. When he recognized him, Amadi ran to meet him. "Zuberi, how did you get here?" The elder raised his face and answered in a hoarse but firm voice. "When truth is imprisoned, it always finds a way to escape." Omardi led him into the hut. When Lem saw him, she dropped to her knees and wept. The old man placed his hand on her head in a gesture of blessing. "Daughter, I heard what they did to you. I fled the village because lies there became law." He sat on the ground, took a deep breath, and continued. "Chief Kali didn't punish you for hiding food. He punished you because you knew too much." Amardi and Lemma exchanged confused glances. The elder went on, staring into the fire Amardi had rekindled. "The chief has been diverting the people's food for months. The sacks of maize meant for the families are hidden in the storage behind the great house. When hunger came, he needed someone to blame, and he chose you, Lumber, because your kindness is a mirror that reflects others' cruelty." The words hit the ground like a stone. Lumber covered her face, trying to hold back her sobs. So all this time he was using hunger as a weapon. The elder nodded bitterly. "Yes, and the people believed him because fear is the best food for a lie." Armadi clenched his fist, his eyes burning with restrained anger. "Then he didn't just deceive the village, he deceived his own fate." Zuberi looked at him silently, then said, "Fate is patient, Armade, but it does not forget." The hut fell silent for a while. Lember wept quietly, and the wind coming through the window seemed to carry away a piece of the pain. Armed walked to the door, looked toward the horizon, and spoke without turning. "If we stay here, the people will remain blind, and evil will rise again." Zubri closed his eyes and replied, "Then go back, but return with truth, not with rage." Lemma lifted her head, surprised. "Go back. They'll kill us." Amadi knelt before her. "You yourself said you only wanted the children to eat. If we go back, maybe we can do more than that. Maybe we can wake the village." Lem hesitated, fear battling courage. Elder Zuber placed a hand on her shoulder. "Daughter, sometimes you must descend the mountain so others can learn how to climb." The sun began to rise, gilding the leaves and warming the cold ground. The fire inside the hut faded, but another fire deeper lit within them. Lumber wiped her tears and stood. "If I am to die, let it be speaking the truth." Amadi smiled for the first time since he found her tied in the square. "Then will—" Descending. The elder rose with difficulty. "Go. The mountain has protected you, but justice must walk where the people live." Amardi looked at the old man, gave a silent bow, and picked up his machete. Lumber with steady steps walked beside him. Behind them, the wind rustled the leaves, carrying the elder's murmur. "When truth comes down from the mountain, even the powerful must bow." And so, with hearts ablaze and spirits at peace, Armid began the journey back. They didn't know what awaited them in the village, death or redemption. But they knew silence was no longer a choice. The mountain remained behind them, but courage that would walk with them to the end. The sun had barely risen when Amdi strapped the bow to his back and adjusted the blanket over Lember's shoulders. The trail back was narrow and steep, covered in stones and ancient roots. Elder Zubi had stayed behind, hidden in the hut, blessing them with his gaze. The descent was slow, but the silence between them was steady, like a promise. The wind brushed Armad's face, carrying the scent of the distant village, mixed with the smoke that always marked the coming dawn. As they neared the valley, Lima's heart tightened. Each step brought her not just closer to the village, but closer to the fear of reliving her shame. "What if they don't believe us?" she asked almost in a whisper. Armed kept walking without looking back. The truth doesn't need to be believed in order to exist. Lumber gripped the torn fabric of her clothes and took a deep breath. Her body was tired, but her soul was awake. The path to the village passed by the river, the same river they had crossed during their escape. The water now flowed calmly, reflecting the clear sky. Arm paused for a moment, looked at the current and said, "Every truth has a price. Lumber, if you don't pay with the body, you pay with the heart." She looked at him with tearful eyes. "Then let our price teach the people how to see." He nodded and moved on. When they reached the first houses, the dogs began to bark. Women who were sweeping the yard dropped their brooms in shock. The news spread quickly like fire through dry grass. "Amardi is back. Lou is alive." Some ran to call the guards. Others hid behind doors, fearing Kaylee's reaction. The hunter didn't stop. He kept walking steady all the way to the center of the village. In the main courtyard, Chief Kali sat on a large mat surrounded by his warriors. When he saw Ahmad and Lumber approaching, he jumped to his feet, his face a storm of anger and disbelief. "How dare you return?" His voice rang out, cutting through the air. The people gathered around, curious and afraid. Ahmadi stopped a few steps away, and for the first time raised his voice before them all. "Arrest me too," he said firmly. "If helping the innocent is a crime, then I am guilty." The crowd murmured. Lumber beside him breathed deeply, trying to stop her hands from trembling. Kambali stepped forward, pointing a finger. "Traitor, you defied the council and shamed your people." Ahmadi didn't flinch. "No, I pulled an innocent woman from the shame you invented." The words fell like thunder. The people looked at one another, confused, torn between fear and the truth that was beginning to rise. Kambali laughed nervously. "Lies. She confessed the theft in front of everyone." Lember stepped forward. Her voice trembled, but it was true. "I confessed to what I didn't do because the pain was louder than justice. But God knows what I hid wasn't stolen. It was bread for the children you left starving." A murmur rose among the women. One of them, Mira, the old woman always muttering proverbs, shouted, "It's true. I saw the warriors taking the maize sacks to the chief's house." Others exchanged looks uneasy. Fear began to lose its grip. Kambali tried to respond, but his voice faltered. Ahmadi, seeing his hesitation, stepped forward. "Tell the people, Chief, where are the grains that should be in the granaries? Tell them why the children starve while your storeroom overflows." The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Kambali looked around for support among his warriors, but many lowered their eyes. Truth, once it arrives, is like fire. No one can hold it back for long. Lumber began to cry, not from pain, but from relief. The people were drawing closer, and the murmurs were turning into voices. Ahmadi raised his hand, asking for silence. "I haven't come to take anyone's place. I've come to remind you that power without justice is rot." Kambala's eyes burned with rage. "You think the people will believe a hunter?" Ahmadi answered without hesitation. "The people believe in those who have the courage to bleed for the truth." The crowd responded with shouts and restrained applause. It was the beginning of something no one could stop. Lemur looked at AMD and realized that in that moment his strength was no longer just his own. It belonged to the people. And so, under the sun, climbing high in the sky, the hunter and the wronged woman returned to the square where humiliation had once begun. But this time they were not prisoners. They were bearers of truth. And the same courtyard that once witnessed shame was now preparing to witness the birth of justice. The village square was packed. Men, women, and children crowded together, forming a circle around Ahmadi, Lemur, and Chief Kali. The air seemed to vibrate, thick with tension. Voices overlapped, some crying out for justice, others calling for silence. Thason stood high, pouring light over sweaty, anxious faces. It was the same square where, days earlier, a woman had been tied and humiliated. Now fate was preparing to reverse the roles. Elder Zuberi emerged from the crowd, supported by two young men. The people stepped aside, respectful, to let him through. His steps were slow, but his gaze was firm. When he reached the center of the square, he planted his staff into the ground and spoke in a hoarse but steady voice before accusing the innocent. "A man should look at his own hands, for lies may fool the eye, but not time." The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Kambali looked at the old man with disdain. "Foolish elder, you've come to join the traitors," but Zuberi raised his chin. "I've come because the truth called me." He pointed a trembling finger at the chief. "You stole the people's food, hid it in the storehouses behind the great house, and used Lumbar's name to cover your shame." A murmur ran through the crowd like an underground river gaining force. Women began to cry, remembering the days of hunger. Men exchanged looks of disbelief. Kambali tried to laugh, but the sound came out weak. "Lies. This delirious old man has no proof." Zuberi raised his arm and signaled. Two young men approached, carrying an opened sack of grain. "We found it in the storage, Chief. The council's seal is still marked." The courtyard erupted in cries. Women clapped, men raised their hands, and children ran in circles. Kambali's face turned pale. He tried to speak, but no voice came. Ahmadi stepped forward. "Used hunger as a weapon and lies as your shield. Today, the shield has shattered." Lember, who until then had remained silent, lifted her head. Her voice, steady and calm, cut through the uproar. "When they tied me here, they said I had betrayed the people. But the one who betrayed them was the man who fed on their misery. I never asked for vengeance. I only asked that the truth be seen." Her words fell over the people like rain after a long drought. Kali looked around, seeking support among his warriors, but none moved. Even the dogs who once followed him now lay quiet. The crowd began to inch closer and circling him with their eyes. The chief stepped back, stumbling over his own mat. Zuberi raised his staff once more. All power without justice ends alone like a rotting tree felled by the wind. Ameta stood beside Lemur. The people now saw them with different eyes, no longer as fugitives, but as those who had dared to confront fear. A man in the crowd shouted, "Justice!" Another answered, "Truth has returned to the village." The voices swelled, forming a chorus. "Justice! Justice!" The sound echoed through the houses, the fields, the hills. Even Kambali seemed to shrink beneath it. He tried to escape, but the warriors surrounded him, now obeying the people. Fear had changed sides. Lem looked at Armad and whispered, "I thought we would die in silence." He answered softly, "God doesn't let the just die in silence." The elder turned to the people. "The council is dissolved. Let the village choose a new path. Let the hands that harvest the maize be the same that share the bread." Applause broke out. The sun, once relentless, now seemed to shine more gently. The truth had broken through the siege of lies. In the center of the square, where once there had been humiliation, now stood dignity. Lemur remained upright, tears streaming down her face, not of pain, but of justice. The people came closer, and a woman placed a bowl of water in her hands. "Drink, child. May this water wash away what fear has stained." Lem drank, and murmurs of approval spread through the crowd. Amardi looked at Kalinau, surrounded by his own warriors. "Justice needs no revenge," he said. "It only needs the truth to be remembered." The chief lowered his head, defeated. The crowd opened a path for him to leave, but no one followed. He walked alone to the village gate, carrying the weight of his shame. As the sun began to set, the village had been transformed. Lemur, standing beside Amdi, felt her heart grow light. "Today the square was washed with tears of truth," said the hunter. She nodded, gazing at the golden horizon. "And where there is truth, there is a new beginning." The people, once divided, now sang. The sound was simple but full of faith. And so, under the same sky that once watched injustice unfold, the village was reborn, united, cleansed, and free. The people's turning point had not been made with weapons, but with courage, because when the just speak, even fear is silenced. The next day dawned differently. The sunlight seemed brighter, the birdsong more alive. There was a new silence in the village, not the silence of fear, but the peace that comes after the storm. The courtyard, which had so often been a stage for humiliation and injustice, was now a place of gathering. The people came together, some bringing baskets of grain, others water and firewood. It was as if the heart of the village had begun to beat again. Kelly had been expelled the day before, escorted by 2 warriors who refused to lay a hand on him. The man who once believed himself the master of everyone's fate, left with his head down, carrying only the clothes on his back and the weight of his stained name. Mothers watched him from afar. Children looked on with curiosity, and the elders shook their heads, remembering that power without soul has no roots. Lumber walked through the square with slow steps, greeting those who passed. Her body still bore wounds, but her gaze was steady, full of the serenity that only someone who has been wronged and survived can know. As she passed, women came to touch her hands, a sign of respect. "You were the voice we never had," one of them said. "No," Lem replied humbly. "I only spoke what pain had already been screaming inside us all." Amardi watched from a distance, leaning against the old bayab tree. He wore no ornaments and bore no posture of a leader. But there was something in him that commanded respect, not the kind born of fear, but of trust. The people began to call him to the center of the square, asking him to speak. He tried to refuse, saying he was just a hunter. But the voices united. "You're the man who didn't stay silent," they said. And so Amardi was led to the same place where just days ago Lay had been tied. Elder Zubri stood beside him, leaning on his staff. "Amadi," he said, "the village needs someone to guide it with justice. Power should not be a throne. It should be service, and the people have chosen you." Amadi remained silent for a moment, looking around. Then he spoke, his voice firm but calm. "If you want me as a leader, know this. I will command noon. Every man and every woman shall have a voice, and truth shall be our law." The people responded with applause and singing, and even the wind seemed to join the chorus. Lemus stepped forward and their eyes met. There was a respect between them that went beyond gratitude. It was the recognition of 2 souls who had walked side by side through pain and faith. "You brought justice back," she said. "We brought it," Amadi replied, "because justice is like fire. It only grows when many blow together." In the days that followed, the village was transformed. The granaries were opened and food redistributed. The children, once thin and silent, were running through the courtyards again. The women sang as they ground the maize, and the men rebuilt the fallen huts. Elder Zuber formed a new council made up of simple folk hunters, healers, artisans, and their power began to serve the people, not the other way around. One afternoon, Lima went alone to the river. She carried a basket of flowers and released them into the current. "Go, carry the pain away," she whispered. Amadi found her there, watching the reflection in the water, still thinking about what happened. "He asked I am," she replied, but no longer with sorrow. "Pain teaches to peace," smiled. "And what has it taught you?" Lemma looked to the horizon and said that the human heart is like the river. It may be dirty for a while, but it always finds a way to be clean again. When they returned to the village, the people were preparing a celebration. The fire burned high and the drums beat with a rhythm of rebirth. Zuberi raised his voice and said, "Today we don't celebrate a man or a woman, but the truth that conquered fear." The people danced, and Amadi for the first time smiled openly. Lumber stood beside him, and the glow in her eyes reflected both fire and hope. That night, under the same sky that had once witnessed so much suffering, the village slept in peace. And when the wind rustled the rooftops, it seemed to say what everyone already felt. Evil may triumph for a time, but when good is true, it always finds a way to bloom again. Amadi continued to lead with humility, and Lemur began to care for the children and the widows, teaching the value of forgiveness. The people prospered, and their names became stories told around the fire, examples of courage and faith. They say that ever since then, whenever the sun rises after a great storm, the baobab tree in the square shakes its leaves as if greeting justice, and the people remember the strength of a man is not in the power he holds, but in the courage to do what is right, even when everyone else stays silent. Time passed, and the stories of Amadi and Lumber became part of the living memory of the village. They were told on full moon nights around the fire, when the elders gathered the children and the women set aside their pestles to listen. The name of Kali was still remembered, but not with hatred. It was remembered as a warning. "May the time when lies were stronger than truth never return," said Elder Zubi, now older and more serene. Always with the same staff that had accompanied him up the mountain, Amadi ruled with wisdom, but never let power rise to his heart. He still hunted, helped with the harvests, and cared for the people like an older brother. When someone called him chief, he would smile and reply, "I'm only the guardian of justice." Under his care, the village flourished. The maize grew strong again, the river ran clear, and homes were built with good wood and united hands. Lember, for her part, became the heart of the village. She cared for the children, taught the women the art of patience and strength, and often repeated the words she had learned through pain. "Life may bind us for a time, but never forever." The young listened to her with admiration. She spoke softly with a faith that didn't come from temples, but from the experience of surviving. "Never bow to the unjust," she said, "nor stay silent in the face of another's pain, because the silence of the just is the food of evil." One night, Amadi and Lumber walked to Theodba. The wind blew gently, and the sky was filled with stars. They sat in the tree's shadow, remembering everything they had lived. "It feels like another world," said Lember with a smile. "It's the same world," Amadi replied, "just one with more truth now." She looked up at the sky and gave thanks in silence. "You know, Amdi," she murmured, "sometimes I think God made us walk through pain, not to punish us, but to teach us courage." He nodded, eyes on the horizon. Pain is the path to just walk when destiny wants to give them a greater name. But time spares not even the most just. Zuberi died in peace, surrounded by the people who called him father, and at his funeral, Lemus spoke before the village. "The elder taught us that wisdom doesn't live in books, but in the courage of those who live without being corrupted. May his example live on in each of us." Her words were met with tears and songs. Years later, when Armed had grown old and his hands trembled when holding a bow, Lumber remained strong, walking between homes, helping, listening, comforting. They say that in his final nights, she sat by his bedside and told stories to the children who came to visit him. She spoke of courage, of faith, and the importance of never turning away from the truth. And Armady, lying there, would smile when he passed. The village wept not as those who lose, but as those who give thanks. Lember planted flowers around the baobab, and beneath its roots, a small stone was placed with a hand-carved inscription. "Here rests the man who heard a woman's plea and answered with justice." Since then, the place became known as the Baobab of Truth. The years went on and the world changed, but the story never faded. The elders told their grandchildren. Lemba was the woman who stood against lies. Amarty, the hunter who challenged power out of compassion. And together they taught us that love is born where justice meets courage. Today, when Thiessen rises over the village and lights up the old courtyard, you can still hear children playing and women singing. And in the wind, there's always an ancient murmur, the echo of a story that time could not silence. The story of two hearts who chose what was right, even when right seemed impossible. And so, in the place where once there was fear and silence, rose a people who came to understand. The true strength of a Manas to protect what is just, even when standing alone. Justice when born from love needs no sword, only courage. And whoever has the courage to defend the truth, even when wounded, is never alone. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our